Welcome to A Slice of SEL, a podcast for educators about social emotional learning.
Welcome to A Slice of SEL. We're the SEL services team at the St. Croix River Education District. I'm Nick.
I'm Rye.
And I'm Courtney.
And to recap, we just finished a 5-part series on integrated SEL instruction, where we talked about all 5 of the SEL standards areas and gave many examples of how to weave each of those into academic instruction. And we are excited to be moving on to something fresh. And today we're going to be talking about school rules, also known as expectations, also known as shared agreements, also known as contracts, aka who knows what else. They go by a lot of names. But we're going to talk about, number 1, why they're so important. Number 2, the different options that teachers and schools have for setting up their rules. And number 3, the pros and cons of each one.
But before that, let's talk about what's filling our buckets this week. You guys, I am just so thankful, and my bucket is overflowing for the team and support system that I have both professionally and personally, and that includes you guys. So just reflecting, there's been some things, and I've just felt so supported, and overflowing.
So sweet. Thanks, Rye.
Yeah, thanks, Rye. What's filling my bucket is very on brand for our episode today. I've been working with a few schools this year on updating their PBIS expectations and making posters to use across the school building and making lessons for teaching those expectations or those rules. And I just love the collaboration and people being really quick and real with their feedback during the meetings and conversations we're having. And you can tell they really want it to be usable versus just kind of nodding along. And that gives me a lot of energy. And I really love seeing teachers being set up to be successful. And that's the kind of thing that gets me excited about my work. So it's filling my bucket this week.
That's awesome, Nick. I can go next or last, I guess. Mine has nothing to do with work. I'm going out of town this weekend to celebrate my 30th birthday. My significant other and I are going up to the North Shore to stay for the weekend. So I'm really excited about that.
That's so fun.
Birthday,
happy
Court.
birthday. Yeah, when this episode gets released, it will be your birthday. So happy birthday, Courtney.
Yay. Thanks, guys.
So we're going to shift to our main topic. And like I said, we're going to be talking about rules today. Number 1, why they are so important. Number 2, different methods for setting up the classroom rules or the rules across the school building. Number 3, the pros and cons of each of those approaches or ways of doing business. And we are talking about this week because students are starting to come back into buildings and spending more and more time in those school buildings. And a few weeks ago, the 3 of us made a very short back to basics classroom management video about classroom management fundamentals that are extra important and helpful right now. Our students really need structure and predictability. So do we, and that's going to continue to be true in the months ahead. So this week and in the weeks ahead on the podcast, we're going to be focusing on those fundamentals like rules, prompting, correcting, because when we're really solid in those fundamental areas, we get a lot of bang for our buck.
So this week, let's talk about what you're hopefully going to get out of this episode. And that'll be different depending on who you are and what your school is already doing building-wide. But say that things are fairly quote-unquote basic. Your school has a code of conduct with a long list of no's. And apart from that reference document, people are kind of left to their own devices. So at bare minimum, you're going to at least leave this episode with a few ideas on how you can create rules or form stronger rules in your individual classroom.
We also wanted to share a few prefaces before we get started. So number 1, we're going to emphasize PBIS because this podcast is primarily meant for our local districts, and the vast majority of those schools implement PBIS. Number 2, we are not going to name names of schools we worked with or in, but we're going to talk about pros and cons and know that our opinions are based on real experiences. But if we say something like, this is how it looked in this school, and I'd highly recommend you don't do it that way, it can feel like we're throwing someone under the bus, so we ain't going to do that. And number 3, we're going to get things wrong. We're not going to be hyper jargony accurate, but between the three of us, there is a good deal of book learning and knowledge of the research base, but we're not perfect. But the good news is that we've all had our boots on the ground in schools, and we've got that real world view to share with you guys.
Yeah, excited for that. So, number one, let's talk about why we set the rules. For one thing, there's a mountain of evidence that having rules, and regardless of what they're called, like expectations or shared agreements, having some kind of rules improves the behavior outcomes that we really care about, like keeping kids in classrooms and having them learn arithmetics and such. Another reason is that the rules set us up to do other crucial things. So they have to be there in order for us to be effective at doing other things that we know are important. For example, like reminding kiddos of what we're expecting from them just before they need to do it, like just before we do group work, like what is really important for them to remember they need to be doing. Or when kiddos screw up, like gently reminding them of what we're expecting from them. The rules also allow us to be clear and consistent about where the bar is for behavior. And that means using consistent and clear language. And what we say and how we say it is arguably the most important tool we have available in a classroom. Good rules work because they don't just live on a piece of construction paper. They actually affect our language throughout the day, and they set us up to be better communicators about behavior. So they're just crucial foundation for all that good stuff and all that language throughout the day. But I think the best illustration of why rules are important for working with students is chatting about why norms are important for adult teams. And you might be saying, Nick, I've been on teams where we didn't set norms and things went fine.
And well, sure, they can. Just like if you get a classroom full of kids with fabulously good behavior skills, great group chemistry, you could probably have a pretty calm classroom and a great quality of life as a teacher without establishing any classroom rules. But we know that is not all that common. And we set norms in teams and adult meetings so we can be clear from each other about where the bar is for our behavior. Sure, you can just wing it and respond when someone does one of your oh-nos, but without norms, the chance of that goes up, and then your communication is more negative. It's all about, you keep interrupting me. Come on, change. You keep playing on your iPad and not contributing to the PLC. Come on, change.
Yeah, so we've talked about why rules are important. Let's talk about how to set them up, those options that are available. So we have a couple of key questions. The number one would be, does your school have a PBIS system? So PBIS, Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports, PBIS is a lot of things. It's basically an acronym or a label that people use for a collection of practices, otherwise known as, things that we do. And when we do all of those things well, or most of them, the research says that we will get these benefits that we want. And my quick elevator speech on PBIS is that the most unique and helpful thing that's part of that package, the thing that it does for us, is creating common language around the school rules across the school building. And it's not meant to be tacked on, just this fancy add-on to what we're already doing. It is our system for telling kids what the rules are. And it allows all the adults in the building to say the same things the same way. So kids aren't hearing different classroom expectations from maybe 7 different teachers, and they aren't hearing different hallway expectations from different teachers.
Yeah, so with PBIS, you have 3 to 5 different school-wide expectations, and you pick 3 to 5 because that's all really a human being can reasonably remember and recall quickly. That includes both kids and adults. But Nick, what's your faves?
Yeah, my personal favorites, and you see these on most of the example PBIS tools that are out there on the internet. My favorite set is safe, respectful, and responsible. Safe, respectful, responsible, as in we are safe, we are respectful, we are responsible. And I really like those 3 because, number one, they cover all your bases. If you ask any teacher what misbehavior issues they confront day to day and then flip those concerns into positives, they're going to easily fall into those 3 categories of safe, respectful, and responsible. And number 2, because those words are already generally common language. So again, not naming names or throwing any schools under the bus here. And in fact, detour for a moment, I actually worked in Delaware in grad school. So just pretend whenever I'm giving a, quote unquote bad example, pretend I'm always talking about Delaware. And you're just going to think like, gosh, schools in Delaware are just a nightmare. just kidding. But anyway, I think the biggest pitfall that schools fall into with those PBIS expectations is sacrificing all practicality on the altar of getting a school spirity acronym. So like that is the number one priority. So like we really want to pick 3 to 5 words that are going to line up and spell out like the name of our school mascot, for example. And there's absolutely nothing inherently wrong with that. But it's just, if that's your number one priority is that school spirity acronym, it's not always going to work out. Like not every school is that lucky. And the fact of the matter is that those 3 to 5 words that you pick have to each be something that a teacher is going to want to use like all day long, every day, day to day. So like, hey, remember to be responsible and write down what homework you have left. Or after like a kid screws up, like, hey, how could we have handled that situation with more respect? Like those 2 sentences with the number one being responsible and the second one I said respect, those aren't sentences that sound completely foreign or goofy to a teacher because those words, safe, respectful, responsible, are just already kind of common language. And I want to be extremely clear here and repeat that point. There is nothing wrong with having a school spirity PBIS acronym. There's a lot to be gained. It makes it feel like really part of your school culture, and it can help bring people like parents on board. And a lot of our schools are doing this. They have school spirity PBIS acronyms. It's going really well. They're really happy with it. They found words that aligned with that school spirit, their mascot, their school colors, and it covers their bases with the behaviors that they want to address. They're really usable words that teachers are comfortable using day to day. So it all worked out. I think it's just a priority question. So imagine that you're in a school and you're forming those PBIS expectations for the first time, and you feel like you're really forcing it to try and get that acronym that spells out that school spirity word. It's a priority question. Like the number one priority to me has to be getting a set of words that are going to cover your bases and that you're going to want to use day to day when you're actually prompting students.
So anyway, we've got those 3 to 5 expectations, those 3 to 5 words, and then we describe what each of those looks like in each area of the school. So what does it look like to be safe in the classroom? What about safe in the hallway? Then at key points in the year, when it makes sense, logically, review those rules with the students. Like, hey, we're about to have a guest speaker at the assembly. Let's review our assembly expectations. Or, hey, we just got back from winter break. Let's review our classroom expectations. Those rules also affect the day-to-day prompting, but we'll talk more about that next week. Can't wait.
Yeah, I can't wait to talk more about that. So many like good, helpful experiences with that personally. But circling back to that main question we asked, so does your school have a PBIS system? And like we said, most of our schools locally do, but if your school does not have a PBIS system, there's a few different ways that things can look. And for the most part, we're talking about rules right now at this very moment for common settings. Because if your school isn't PBIS, it's kind of a given that when it comes to the classroom, you're going to be making up your own individual classroom rules. So framing it, let's think about common settings for a moment, like hallways and bathrooms and such, cafeteria. So for those common settings in non-PBIS schools, the base level then is just the student code of conduct. And by base level, I mean like the thing that we all share that we have in common. And the student code of conduct is very detailed. Sometimes schools review it at the beginning of a school year and highlight key points. Generally, it's things that have come up as trends. So we really want to emphasize like, don't do these things, don't do these things, do these things. So they pick and choose kind of what they want to cover because it's a big document. It's a big list. It's meant to be like super comprehensive. But yeah, that student code of conduct, and I can speak from personal experience as a former middle schooler, is not information that can be retained and memorized and, recalled, and it's going to like directly affect communication and interactions in the school day to day.
Yeah, and generally in those cases, what happens is that teachers are making up their own classroom rules and then trying to carry them over into the common settings. Or each classroom comes up with their own rules for common settings like, hey, when we go out in the hallway, what do we do?
Yeah, so what Rye said is generally what happens in those non-PBIS schools. But other things that might happen. A school might have kind of a pseudo-PBIS deal going on where they have a few like core expectations that apply to common settings, and it might be safe, respectful, responsible, but they just don't go through the full work of defining what each one of those things looks like in each specific location in the building. So we have more kind of vague ideas of across our whole building, what does safe mean? Across our whole building, what does respectful mean? You get the idea. So it's just not as detailed. It's a little more vague. And you also might see a non-PBIS school kind of sporadically put up signs around the building that pull bits of that code of conduct out and try to give people these little cues and reminders in certain hot spots, like in the hallway or by the water fountains. And for example, like say voice volume has been a big issue in the hallway, or it was last spring. We might come back in the hallway into the school in autumn and see a sign up that says keep voices off, just in some parts of the building in some hallways. So it's not kind of as planful and comprehensive as you would see with like a full thought out PBIS system. It's more kind of, again, pulling out little pieces of your code of conduct and just putting up signs that are going to cue about some specific things.
So we're obviously a biased pro PBIS crowd here, but it's fair to say that PBIS has to be done well. So for example, we have to have a good acronym, good posters for it to feel helpful instead of awkward. It's not an automatic awesome deal. But flip that, just because a school doesn't have PBIS does not mean they're awful and that the common settings are a nightmare.
Yeah, absolutely not. Like things can function well. But I would say, like, I've worked in PBIS schools and non-PBIS schools, and using football jargon, like the floor is higher, like we say for quarterbacks, like the floor is higher. The floor is higher in PBIS schools than non-PBIS schools. Like with leadership and teacher turnover, having that PBIS structure entrenched and that consistency is going to keep things relatively stable. And just generally speaking, with a broad brush, like we're going to be less reliant on maybe like a few all-star people who do a lot of work to take that code of conduct and keep making whatever tools and messages, like sending the emails, talking in staff meetings, making the little posters. It just relies a little bit more on people being really on it from year to year to kind of keep that kind of less structured system going and keep it stable. So the number 2 question we're going to talk about is, if I am in a PBIS school, do we have classroom expectations? And you might say, like, well, duh, you do, because you have expectations for each setting of the building, but not all PBIS schools do have classroom expectations. Some will, for example, say like, hey, we're safe, respectful, and responsible in the hallways, in bathrooms, in the auditorium, in the cafeteria, all those common areas of the building. But in classrooms, it's totally up to each teacher.
Yeah, and why would you do this? There is something good to be gained. Teachers have unique needs and unique styles. And I mean, I know from experience as a teacher, it is nice to have autonomy as a teacher to do your own thing. But what do you lose? First is that you lose that common language. Kids aren't really as likely to be hearing the same phrases throughout the day from different adults. And second, kids will have to learn different sets of rules for different teachers, and it's harder to get them, with it.
And those are big cons. So I think the best way to go about this in general, if you're in a PBIS building, is having those PBIS expectations for classrooms, having the same set consistent across all the classrooms, but making sure the teachers have input and a voice into what those expectations are, what language we're expecting each other to use. And that is vital, extremely vital, because if a matrix and the language in it, if that PBIS language is clunky and it's way far off from what I need to say or what I'm going to say, you're going to have to drag me as a teacher into using it, and come on, it's never really going to happen.
But anyway, setting our preferences aside, say that you're in a PBIS building with no classroom expectations. I think there's some value in each teacher at least framing the rules around those 3 to 5 school-wide expectations. For example, I throw a big 3-column table on my sparkboard one day, and I ask, what is safe going to look like in our classroom? So some kids might say, keep your hands to yourself, or don't shove people. What's respectful going to look like? Some kids might say, use a nice voice. So this is going to make our classroom rules feel more connected to what we're expected to do outside of the classroom.
Yeah, so that's kind of a way to, if we're going to have our individual classroom rules, like frame them around at least those 3 to 5 words that apply to the rest of the building to make it feel more connected. And we've already kind of spoiled it, but in a moment, we're going to talk about co-developing rules with your kiddos. And that's something that's part of the responsive classroom program, if you've heard of that, but it's certainly not exclusive to it. And this is one of those ideas for how PBIS and responsive classroom can work together. Because in responsive classroom, they really want you to get input from your students on the rules and make them up together. But if you're in a PBIS school, you can still do that. But again, by trying to put a little structure around it and frame the rules that you come up with your kiddos around those 3 to 5 school-wide expectations, responsive classroom and PBIS can work really nicely together, and you can kind of get the best of both worlds. And that's applicable locally because we have multiple elementary schools that are trained in responsive classroom and are also working with PBIS. So the number 3 question is, if I am developing my own classroom rules by myself, am I going to go top down or collect student input? So top down, quote unquote, that's just bringing our own set of rules to our own individual classroom. And generally speaking, of the options that we're talking about, this is the one with the most cons and the fewest pros. Like that top down, me just walking into my classroom, bringing my own set of rules that don't connect to the rest of the building, and not getting student input into what those rules are. And my goodness, of course, that can be successful. But right off the bat, you're losing the consistency benefits that you get from PBIS, like that consistency of language across the whole school with your colleagues. And you're losing the student investment and the care about the rules benefits that you get when you spend some time getting student input on the rules. So you're losing those 2 potential benefits if you go down this road. And you might be thinking PBIS is top down, students didn't have a voice in those rules, generally speaking. They typically don't. And yeah, PBIS is top down for the most part. I mean, ideally, when you're first developing your PBIS expectations for every setting in the building, but, including the classroom, ideally you're going to get student input. And that might be student representatives, or if you're in a elementary school with littles, you might have them circle up and just ask some questions about so you get some student input. And I did this in a building recently, a secondary building where we're revamping the PBIS expectations. We got some student input. But even if we did that, schools aren't often repeating that process year to year, every single year. And certainly not, each individual classroom having a big significant say in what the PBIS expectations are. So PBIS, does have that con where it's kind of the rules are already set, and as a student, they are coming to me. One of the ways that I think PBIS buildings can get some of that student voice and investment back is by, right before we review the classroom expectations, for example, you ask questions like, what would safe look like in our classroom? And then have a discussion with the kids. And what would respect look like in our classroom? What do you think is important? Generating that student discussion. And then we show those pre-established, top-down PBIS expectations that all are already set. But as we go through those, we are actively connecting them to what the students just said. So it's kind of a backwards approach, but that is a good way to, even though the PBIS expectations are kind of preset top-down, to get those consistency benefits, still connecting them to student voice and what students valued.
Yeah, and just circling back, if I don't have PBIS rules in my classroom, I'm coming up with them on my own, but I, for some reason, don't want to collect student input. Here are just 4 good ones. So number 1 is to respect your classmates and teacher. Number 2, listen carefully and follow directions. 3, raise your hand before speaking or leaving your seat. And number 4, keep hands, feet, and objects to yourself. Probably all of those were very familiar to you, but those 4 short phrases cover a lot of ground. So if your kids are meeting those 4 bars, your classroom is going to be running pretty smoothly.
And with that, we met our, you're going to finish this episode at the bare minimum, having an idea for how to set your classroom rules. So we just met that mark. Thank you, Ryan.
And another thing to mention about those 4 is that they're fairly specific and clear. Clarity is really important because it gives kids that predictability and the structure. We're going to be on the same page as much as we can be about what each rule means. That's not as much the case, though, when we get into vague rules like everyone will feel wanted or dream big or love to learn.
And that kind of leads us to our next and our final discussion point, what it's like to co-develop rules with your students. And as we said a moment ago, this is how it happens in the responsive classroom program, but it's certainly not limited to that. Any teacher can be, co-developing the rules with their kids. And you might actually want to go back and listen to our very first podcast episode about setting norms in adult teams, because come on, if you've ever done that before, it's basically the exact same process with kids.
So you basically start open-ended with brainstorming about what you want. You get a lot of vague ideas. You refine those down, and then you carve out 3 to 5 specific rules for your class. So you might start, for example, with a question like, without naming names, what have you not liked in other classes you've been in? And kids might say people interrupting the teacher or kids bullying each other. And the same as we would with adults in setting norms, if we start negative like that, it can help open people up, but then you want to make sure to flip it. So if we don't like people interrupting each other, what can we all agree to do so that doesn't happen? Maybe only one person talks at a time. How does that sound?
Yeah, and you can also skip the negative step and just go straight to a question like, what ideas do you have for what we could all agree to do so that this is a nice classroom where we want to come and be in every day?
Yeah, and this is where, again, circling back to what Courtney said a minute ago, you might end up with these kind of vague ideas like, we want to dream big, or we want to all feel welcome when we get to the classroom. Those kind of like vague things.
Yeah, they can be vague, and there's probably going to be a lot of ideas. If we end up with a long list of ideas, it's not going to be manageable for us to use them every day. So if it's too long, you might as well not have it. And that's exactly how it is with norms for adult meetings.
Yeah, I'm on a very large team right now where we were just having a conversation and reflecting like, hey, we almost barely ever pause to review our norms and remind ourselves of them before we start a meeting because they're so long. Like they have everything in detail that we care about, but we might as well not even have them because it's just too many words to be practical day to day.
Yeah, that's why we have to refine the list of rules down. It's really a beautiful craft because, again, we want this short list of phrases, and we want each of them to be clear, but we also want it to cover a lot of ground.
And that's why, honestly, after taking that student input and refining it, you very well might end up with a list of 5 rules very similar to what you may have come up with on your own. But hey, students were part of the process and they feel that, and you can drill down and reference what each of those rules meant to the whole class. So say that later in the term, we're having issues with people interrupting each other, and I take a pause and I talk to the class about it. I might say, hey, one of our rules is respect your classmates and your teacher. Remember when we came up with these? We said we really didn't like people talking over each other, so we wanted one person talking at a time, and that's part of being respectful.
Yeah, so it is really ending up with a practical set of like 3 to 5 short phrases, but you have a lot more you can say about each of those to like drill down and dive in and expand on it. So that is a nice part of getting all that conversation and student input when you're kind of co-developing them and then kind of refining it down. So you've got this, you end up with this short phrase, but you can kind of connect it back to all these ideas that the students had that they care about. It's kind of like the same thing with PBIS, like all the expectations that we might put under be safe or be respectful or be responsible. I'm not saying all those all the time constantly. Like I can still get back to that just short phrase of like, hey, we are respectful in this school. And that kind of covers a lot of ground conceptually. It's like the TARDIS with Doctor Who. There's a lot packaged into that tiny little phone booth.
Awesome.
So let's talk takeaways. Rules are important because they give our classrooms and our schools structure, something we always need, and we particularly need it now with the COVID year that we're in. They sometimes get a bad rap because they get that authoritarian connotation, like the principal in the Breakfast Club when he says things like, you better smarten up, Buster, that kind of tone to them. But structure and support are two things they need to coexist in schools, and the rules need to be part of that. They provide that structure for us, but they also allow us to be supportive. They allow us to be proactive and set students up for success. And I can't wait to talk more next week about some of the things that they allow us to do, like prompting. But yeah, they're great, and there's different ways to set those rules up. Some allow us to be more consistent with our colleagues, like PBIS. Some allow us to maximize student input and their investment, like when we co-develop the rules with our students. And some are kind of a hybrid, trying to get the best of both of those worlds. We hope that you've learned and or felt some reassurance today. Hope you've got a set of rules that supports you and your students, or you feel now like you're pointed in the right direction to get there. And we can't wait to spend next week talking more about how to use the rules day to day.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. Thanks for spending time with us today. Make sure to subscribe, and if you're on YouTube, click the bell so that you're notified when new episodes are released each week. We'll see you when you come back for another Slice of SEL.
Thanks, guys. Bye. Happy birthday, Courtney.
Thank you.